If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would miss you. My son said it lightly, as if he were commenting on the music in the room. He did not look at me when the words left his mouth. He lifted his glass instead, smiling at someone else across the table, confident in the echo he knew would follow. There was a pause. Not long enough to be awkward. Just long enough for the sentence to land. Then the laughter came. It was not nervous. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of laughter people use when they want to belong to the winning side of a moment. My daughter-in-law pressed her lips together as if she were being polite, but her eyes were bright with relief. A cousin snorted into his drink. Someone else said something about dark humor. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, staring at the white tablecloth I had paid for, listening to the sound of people enjoying my erasure. No one told him to stop. No one said my name. That was when I understood something I had been refusing to see for years. They did not think they were being cruel. They thought they were being honest. They believed I was already gone. So I decided to disappear for real. 3 days later, my phone would not stop ringing. 30 missed calls. Voicemails stacked with panic and confusion. And suddenly, I was the one they were desperate to find. But by then, I was already somewhere else. The dinner ended the way these things always do, with forced smiles and the scrape of chairs against the floor. Someone asked if I needed a ride home. I said no. My son did not argue. He had already turned his body away from me, his attention pulled back into the orbit where I no longer existed. I walked out into the warm night alone. It was early autumn, the air still heavy, the kind of evening that usually made me linger. That night, I kept moving. I drove without turning on the radio. I let the silence sit beside me in the passenger seat. By the time I reached my apartment, there were no messages waiting. No check-in. No, "Are you okay?" I stood in the doorway with my keys in my hand and felt something inside me finally go still. Not numb. Not broken. Just finished. I was 58 years old, and I had spent most of my life making sure other people were comfortable. I had been the one who remembered birthdays, smoothed over conflicts, absorbed sharp words so no one else had to feel them. Somewhere along the way, that became my entire role. That night, I did not cry. I did not pace. I sat on the edge of my bed and took off my shoes slowly, deliberately, as if I were learning how to move in a new body. I thought about all the times I had been told I was too sensitive. All the jokes I had been expected to swallow. All the moments when I had felt something was wrong, but convinced myself that love meant endurance. I slept deeply. When I woke in the morning, my phone was still silent. The first day passed quietly. I made coffee. I answered emails. I went for a walk through my neighborhood and noticed things I had not noticed in years. The crooked fence on Maple Street, the smell of bread from the bakery on the corner. Life continued without me being required to manage it. By the second day, I began to feel something else. Not sadness. Space. I did not tell anyone where I was going. I packed a small bag and drove north far enough that my routines would not follow me. I checked into a modest hotel under my maiden name. I turned off location sharing. I put my phone face down on the nightstand. I told myself I would give it a week. Just one. Not as punishment, as truth. On the third morning, the calls started. At first, I ignored them. Then, I watched them pile up one after another, my son's name lighting up the screen until it felt absurd. I listened to the voicemails later. His voice was irritated at first, then confused, then sharp with something close to fear. He did not apologize. He asked where I was. He asked what I was doing. He asked why I was making things difficult. He did not ask if I was hurt. That was when I knew I had made the right choice. I had spent years thinking that being needed was the same as being loved. I had mistaken access for affection, obligation for connection. Disappearing showed me the difference. When I did not show up, the machine kept running for a while. Then it started to grind. I imagined them at their kitchen table, my son tapping his phone, my daughter-in-law pacing, both of them irritated by a problem they could not immediately solve. They were not missing me. They were missing what I did. I sat by the window of that hotel room and watched the afternoon light shift across the carpet. For the first time in a long while, no one expected anything from me. I did not have to explain myself. I did not have to soften my tone or make a joke to ease the air. I thought about the woman I had been before I became invisible. The woman who had built a career from the ground up, who knew how to read contracts, and people who understood how systems worked because she had kept them running. That woman had not disappeared. She had only been set aside. That night I ordered room service and ate alone slowly, without rushing to make conversation. I slept with the curtains open and woke to sunlight instead of obligation. Somewhere between the third and fourth call, my phone went quiet again. They had run out of words. I knew then that silence was not empty. It was full of information. I did not know yet how far this would go. I did not know what would break first or how much I would lose along the way. I only knew that I could not return to a table where my absence was a punchline. They had told me who I was to them. I believed them. And believing them changed everything. Invisibility does not arrive all at once. It seeps in quietly the way dust settles on furniture no one touches anymore. You do not notice it day to day. You notice it years later when someone speaks about you as if you are not in the room and no one corrects them. That dinner did not erase me. It confirmed what had already been happening for a long time. My name is Eleanor Hayes, Ellie to people who once knew me well. I was 59 years old when my son decided the world would not miss me. Long before I was anyone's mother, I was someone who made decisions that mattered. I had a career that required a steady hand and a sharp eye, the kind where mistakes cost real money and reputations. I spent 3 decades in operations and compliance for regional healthcare networks, the unglamorous backbone work that keeps hospitals open and lawsuits away. I was the person executives called when something was wrong and no one wanted their name attached to the fix. I was good at it. Not flashy, not loud, but reliable in the way that keeps systems standing. I stepped back from that world when my son's life began to accelerate. His marriage, his move, his need for help that was supposed to be temporary. I told myself I was choosing family over work as if those were the only options. I reduced my hours. Then I consulted. Then I quietly stopped altogether. I did not become smaller. I became convenient. Over time, the language around me shifted. I was no longer introduced by what I had done, but by what I was to someone else, his mother. The extra set of hands, the safety net. I noticed it and ignored it, because love, I believed, was not something you kept score on. My son Andrew liked to tell people I was old-fashioned. He said it with a smile as if it were affectionate. He told them I worried too much, that I had trouble letting go. He framed my caution as control my experience as anxiety. It made him sound modern and patient. It made me sound like a relic. I let him. What I did not let go of was the part of myself that understood how things worked. I never stopped reading contracts. I never stopped tracking details. I never stopped noticing who relied on what and how easily assumptions became dependencies. I simply stopped explaining myself. Andrew never asked how anything was structured. He did not ask how insurance policies renewed themselves or why certain deadlines never seemed to be missed. He did not ask why problems resolved before they reached him. He mistook stability for evidence of his own competence. I had once believed that if I made his life smooth enough, he would appreciate it. What I learned instead was that comfort breeds blindness. When he and his wife Claire moved into their house, I helped. I told myself it was alone in spirit, a gift in practice. I handled paperwork, coordinated timelines, reviewed terms. I was careful without announcing it. I signed nothing in haste. I trusted that trust was mutual. Claire liked to call herself independent. She said it often, especially when posting about her life online. She did not like to acknowledge where support came from unless it reflected well on her. When things worked, it was because she was organized. When they didn't, it was because someone else had failed. I did not challenge her narrative. I believed my silence was generosity. What I did not realize then was that silence also teaches people what they can get away with. The years folded into each other. I became background. My suggestions were acknowledged and ignored. My presence was optional. I was invited out of habit, not desire. I told myself this was the natural order of things, that children grow up and parents step back. But stepping back does not mean stepping out of your own life. That dinner forced me to confront the truth I had been circling for years. Andrew did not see me as a person who had chosen to slow down. He saw me as someone who had run out of value. In his mind, my usefulness had expired. What he did not know was that I had never fully let go of responsibility. I had only made it invisible. I had built systems that did not announce themselves. I kept certain arrangements under my control, not because I wanted power, but because I understood risk. I believed that someone should always be paying attention. That someone quietly was me. I had never corrected Andrew when he assumed things ran on autopilot. I never reminded him how many moving parts his life rested on. I told myself it was kinder that way. That was my mistake. The night I left, I did not feel anger. I felt clarity. Anger asks for reaction. Clarity asks for action. For the first time, I stopped trying to be understood. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. I stopped wondering how to phrase things so they would land gently. I realized that no combination of words would make someone value what they had already dismissed. Disappearing was not an act of revenge. It was an act of boundary. I was not punishing anyone. I was removing myself from a role I had outgrown. There was a part of me that expected guilt to arrive. It did not. What arrived instead was grief, clean and sharp, for the relationship I thought I had, and the woman I had been while maintaining it. I mourned the version of myself who believed endurance was love. By the third day, when the call started, I understood something else. They were not asking where I was because they missed me. They were asking because something was no longer working. I listened to the messages without responding. Andrew sounded inconvenienced, not concerned. Claire sounded irritated, not worried. Their language was transactional. Where are you? We need to talk. Call me back. Need is not the same as care. I did not answer because I needed to hear what they would say next. I needed to know how long it would take before someone asked if I was all right. That question never came. I sat in that quiet room and took stock of who I was without them. I remembered the woman who had navigated boardrooms and crises with steady hands. The woman who did not flinch when things went wrong because she had planned for them. That woman had not disappeared. She had simply been buried under obligation. Andrew thought I worried because I was weak. In truth, I worried because I saw patterns. I knew how quickly systems fail when the wrong assumptions are left unchecked. I had spent years preventing consequences without realizing I was teaching him that consequences did not exist. That realization hurt more than the insult at the table. By the end of that week, I understood that returning would only restore the illusionist that nothing had changed. I was no longer interested in illusions. I wanted truth, even if it was uncomfortable. Disappearing was not about teaching Andrew a lesson. It was about teaching myself one. I did not need to earn my place by being useful. I did not need to perform motherhood to justify my existence. I had allowed myself to be rewritten because it was easier than insisting on respect. That choice had cost me my voice. I decided then that whatever came next would happen without my apology. I would not explain my absence or soften its impact. I would let the silence speak for me. They had forgotten who I was. I was about to remember. I did not announce my departure. I did not stand up and say anything meaningful. I stayed until the end of the evening, long enough that no one could accuse me of dramatics. Andrew laughed easily after that sentence, the one that told me exactly how much space I occupied in his life. He refilled his glass. Claire leaned closer to him, her hand resting on his arm as if to anchor herself to the center of the room. Conversation resumed without effort, flowing around me, the way water moves around a stone. I watched it happen with a strange sense of distance, like I had already stepped outside my body. I nodded when spoken to. I smiled when expected. I became very good very quickly at being harmless. When it was time to leave, I stood and thanked the host. Someone asked if I needed help carrying anything. I said no. Andrew did not look up from his phone. There was no moment of hesitation, no last glance in my direction, no instinct to check if I was all right. That was the first truth of the night. My absence would not register immediately. I walked to my car alone. The air was thick and warm, the kind that clings to your skin. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, waiting for something to break the spell. A text, a call, anything that suggested I mattered enough to pause the evening. Nothing came. The drive home was quiet. I did not turn on the radio. I wanted to hear my own thoughts without interruption. The city lights passed by in a familiar blur, streets I had driven thousands of times without noticing. That night, every red light felt deliberate, every stop a chance to turn around. I did not. By the time I reached my apartment, the building was dark and still. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it softly behind me. I stood there, keys in my hand, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic through the window. I felt tired, but not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that comes from holding yourself in place for too long. I took off my shoes and set them neatly by the door. I washed my hands and watched the water swirl down the drain. Ordinary things. Grounding things. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if speed might pull me back into old habits. I checked my phone once. No messages. No missed calls. For the first time, the quiet did not feel like punishment. It felt like space. That night, I slept deeply. When I woke, sunlight cut through the blinds, bright and unapologetic. I lay there for a few minutes, waiting for the familiar rush of obligation to arrive. The mental checklist. The reflex to reach for my phone and see what needed fixing. Nothing did. I made coffee and drank it by the window. I watched a woman walk her dog across the street, the leash slack between them. They moved without urgency, unburdened by anyone else's expectations. By mid-morning, I knew I was not going to spend the day pretending nothing had happened. Instead, I packed a small bag. Not everything, just enough. Clothes I liked. A book I had been meaning to read. My charger, I left the rest exactly as it was. This was not an escape. It was a pause. I drove north without a plan, letting the road decide for me. I stopped when the familiar gave way to the unfamiliar, when the exit stopped calling my name. I checked into a quiet hotel under my maiden name and asked for a room away from the elevator. When the door closed behind me, I leaned against it for a moment and let out a breath I did not know I had been holding. The room was simple, neutral, no memories attached. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around, registering the absence of history. There were no photographs of people I was supposed to be. No objects that told me who I had been for others. I turned my phone face down on the nightstand. The first few hours were harder than I expected. My body moved before my mind caught up, reaching for the phone out of habit, anticipating a call that would give me permission to return. I told myself I would wait. Just until the morning. Just to see what happened. What happened was nothing. No one checked in. No one asked where I was. No one expressed concern. The silence stretched and held. That was the second truth. I had been carrying more of the relationship than I realized. By the second day, I felt the pull to intervene. Old instincts resurfaced, sharp and familiar. If I did not step in now, something might go wrong. Someone might be inconvenienced. Someone might be uncomfortable. I let the feeling pass. Disappearing, I realized, was not about running away. It was about refusing to run back. I turned off notifications. I disabled location sharing. I removed shortcuts that made it too easy for people to reach me without thinking. Each small action felt deliberate, like locking a door I had left open for years. That afternoon, I walked through a nearby park and watched families move around each other. Children ran ahead, confident that someone was watching. Parents lingered behind, present but not consumed. The balance struck me. Support without erasure, care without control. I had lost that balance somewhere along the way. That night I ordered dinner and ate slowly, tasting my food instead of rushing through it. I slept with the curtains open and woke to sunlight again, the quiet unbroken. On the third morning, my phone buzzed for the first time. Andrew's name lit up the screen. I watched it ring until it stopped. A voicemail followed, then another. His tone was irritated, clipped. "Where are you? Call me back. This isn't funny." Claire texted next. "We need to talk. This is getting inconvenient." Inconvenient. I listened to the messages once, then set the phone down. The words confirmed what I needed to know. They did not miss me. They missed the function I served. I sat at the small desk in the room and opened my notebook. I wrote down what I felt, not to send to anyone, but to see it clearly. Hurt, relief, sadness, resolve. The list surprised me with its order. I realized then that if I answered, if I explained myself, I would slide back into the role they expected. The one who smoothed things over. The one who reassured them that nothing fundamental had changed. Something had. The urge to return came in waves. Each time I reminded myself why I had left. Not to teach a lesson, not to prove a point, but to reclaim myself. That evening I stood by the window and watched the sky darken. I thought about all the times I had stayed quiet to keep the peace. All the ways I had shrunk myself so others could feel tall. I was done shrinking. I decided then that my absence would be a test, not for them, but for me. Could I hold the line when silence became uncomfortable? Could I let consequences exist without rushing to soften them? I turned off my phone completely and placed it in the drawer. For the first time in years, there was nothing I needed to do. As night settled in, I felt the weight of the choice I had made. It was not easy. It was not painless. But it was clear. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar quiet. Somewhere people were continuing their lives without me. Somewhere systems I had once managed were operating on their own. I wondered how long it would take before my absence mattered. Then I let myself sleep, knowing that when they finally noticed, it would already be too late to pretend nothing had changed. For the first 2 days, they treated my silence like a mood. Andrew told himself I was sulking. I could picture him shrugging it off, saying something casual about giving me space the way people do when they want to feel generous without actually changing their behavior. Claire would have agreed, her tone light, her expression faintly annoyed. She never liked disruptions she could not manage. They did not call again after those first messages. They waited. From where I was sitting, the waiting was loud. I spent those days moving through my hours without urgency. I woke early and walked through quiet streets, the kind where people nod politely but do not ask questions. I ate when I was hungry, not when it was convenient. I read in the afternoons and let time stretch without filling it. Every so often, I would feel the old pull to check in, to smooth things over, to preempt whatever inconvenience might be forming. That instinct had been trained into me over decades, sharpened by repetition. I ignored it. On the third day, the tone shifted. It began with small things. Andrew texted again, not to ask how I was, but to ask if I had seen a particular email. When I did not respond, he called once and hung up before it could go to voicemail. That told me more than a long message ever could. He wanted confirmation, not conversation. Claire followed with a message of her own. "Can you please call us back? We're trying to sort something out." Trying, sorting, always vague, always urgent without being specific. I did not answer. From a distance, I could see what they could not. The machine had been running smoothly because someone had been quietly adjusting the gears. Without that presence, the first slips were subtle enough to dismiss. Appointments had to be rescheduled. A deadline was misunderstood. A form was submitted incorrectly and kicked back for revision. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. Andrew grew irritated. I imagined him pacing phone in hand, muttering about inefficiency. He had always believed obstacles were the result of other people's incompetence. It never occurred to him that the absence of support might be the cause. Claire took it personally. She always did. When things went wrong, it meant someone had failed her. She did not like feeling exposed, and she especially did not like feeling dependent. Their irritation did not turn into concern. It turned into blame. I learned this later through fragments, through things said carelessly to people who assumed I would never hear them. At the time, all I felt was the quiet confirmation of what I already knew. I had not been missed. I had been taken for granted. On the fourth day, Andrew left a voicemail that was different from the rest. His voice was tight-controlled. He said my name twice, as if repetition might summon me. He asked where I was, and added that this was becoming a problem. Not for him, for everyone. That distinction mattered. I listened to the message once and deleted it. I was not interested in being the solution to a problem that only existed because of my absence. That afternoon, I sat in a cafe and watched people come and go tour. Two women at the table beside me were deep in conversation, their voices low and intense. One of them laughed, suddenly a bright sound that startled both of us. It reminded me of the laughter at the dinner table, the way it had landed without warning. I realized then that laughter is not always a sign of joy. Sometimes it is a signal of safety, a way of aligning with power. At home, Andrew was beginning to feel unsafe. By the fifth day, the cracks widened. A third party reached out to me, someone neutral, someone who had no emotional investment in the family dynamic. The message was polite, professional, and cautious. They were trying to clarify something that had always been handled quietly and efficiently before. I did not respond. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Not because I wanted things to fail, but because I needed to see what would happen when I did not intervene, when I allowed the system to reveal its true dependencies. Andrew's frustration tipped into anger. He called again, this time letting the phone ring until voicemail picked up. His message was sharper now. He accused me of being dramatic. He said I was overreacting. He reminded me of everything he had done for me. It was the first time he framed my absence as betrayal. Claire sent a message that evening that said simply, "This is affecting us. Not we're worried. Not are you okay. Affecting." I put my phone down and stared out the window as the sun dipped below the buildings across the street. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the one that used to tell me to fix things quickly before they escalated. I breathed through it. Silence, I was learning, is not passive. It is an action. It holds space. It forces others to confront what they usually avoid. On the sixth day, something finally broke. It was not dramatic, no shouting, no public scene, just a quiet failure with real consequences. Something that could not be laughed off or blamed on mood. Something that required accountability. Andrew panicked. The messages multiplied. The calls came faster. His voice lost its edge and picked up something closer to urgency. He asked me to please call him back. He said they needed to talk. He said this wasn't how family handled things. Family. The word arrived late like an afterthought. I still did not respond. That night, I allowed myself to imagine the scene. Andrew hunched over his laptop, refreshing his inbox. Claire pacing the kitchen, her tone sharp, her movements quick. The two of them circling the same problem from opposite sides, each convinced the other should fix it. For the first time, I was not there to absorb the tension. The next morning, I woke to a single missed call and no voicemail. That silence felt different. He was no longer angry. He was thinking. I took a long walk and let the cool air steady me. I knew what was coming next. Not apology, not reflection, strategy. Andrew had always believed that problems could be solved by finding the right person to lean on. He would start reaching outward now, looking for substitutes, advisors, consultants, anyone who could restore the sense of control he was losing. He would not look inward. Not yet. That was the pattern. When things became uncomfortable, he externalized the cause. He avoided the one place where the answer lived, with me. By the end of the week, the tone of the messages changed again. They became cautious, polite, almost friendly. Andrew texted that he hoped I was well, that they missed me, that maybe we could talk soon. Claire sent a brief note that said she hoped everything was okay and that they were worried. Worried about what she did not say. I did not respond to those either. I sat in my quiet room and thought about the years I had spent making sure other people did not feel this discomfort. How often I had stepped in before irritation could turn into conflict. How much emotional labor I had provided without ever naming it as such. Removing myself had revealed the shape of that labor in negative space. They were beginning to feel it now. The first real crack had appeared, and it had nothing to do with hurt feelings. It had to do with consequences. With the realization that some things could not be fixed with charm or dismissal. As night fell, I turned my phone off again and placed it in the drawer. I felt steady, anchored in a decision I no longer questioned. They were still telling themselves this was temporary, that I would come back once I had made my point. They were wrong. What they did not understand yet was that the silence was not a tactic. It was a boundary. And boundaries, once drawn, change everything. By the time Andrew realized he could not replace me, the damage was already unfolding. The first substitute failed quietly. A consultant he hired in haste, recommended by a friend who knew a guy lasted less than a week. The man spoke confidently, charged aggressively, and asked questions that revealed how little he understood the machinery he was meant to manage. Andrew grew impatient with him almost immediately. I could imagine the meeting clearly. Andrew leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, irritation masked as authority. The consultant talking in circles, promising frameworks instead of results. Claire hovering nearby, offering suggestions that complicated rather than clarified. None of them knew where the actual pressure points were. They did not know which calls mattered, which deadlines were flexible, which people needed reassurance, and which needed silence. They were guessing. Guessing is expensive. By midweek, the polite messages stopped again. Andrew's tone reverted to clipped efficiency, as if authority alone could stabilize things. He asked for updates he could not interpret and demanded timelines he could not enforce. Claire responded by tightening control in the only way she knew how. She corrected people publicly. She rewrote plans that had already been approved. She sent emails late at night and expected immediate replies. The atmosphere thickened. Stress always exposes character. Without me absorbing the friction, it ricocheted between them. Small disagreements escalated into arguments that ended without resolution. Each blamed the other for the growing sense of instability. At the center of it all was a single truth they had not yet articulated: they were operating blind. I had not withheld information maliciously. I had never needed to. Knowledge had accumulated around me naturally over time, because I paid attention. I listened. I remembered patterns. I noticed what others dismissed as trivial. Now those patterns were unraveling. On Thursday afternoon, Andrew called again. This time he left a voicemail that was almost conciliatory. He said he hoped I was taking care of myself. He said he understood if I needed space. He said they could really use my perspective on a few things. Perspective. Not help, not apology. Still, it was progress. I did not respond. That evening, I sat alone with a notebook open in front of me. I had begun writing things down, not as a plan, but as an inventory. What I had done, what I had carried, what I had quietly prevented. The list surprised even me. I had smoothed over conflicts before they reached escalation. I had flagged risks early often, before anyone else noticed them. I had maintained relationships that did not benefit me directly, but kept the system functioning. I had done all of this without recognition, without authority, without complaint. The realization settled heavily, but cleanly. It explained why my absence felt disruptive in ways they could not name. They were not missing a person. They were missing a function. On Friday morning, something broke in a way that could not be concealed. Andrew learned about it from someone else, which made it worse. Nothing wounded his pride faster than being the last to know. The message he left that afternoon was short and tense. He asked me to call him back immediately. Not please, not when you can, immediately. I went for a long walk instead. When I returned, I found 3 missed calls and a text from Claire. It was the first direct message she had sent since I left. We need to talk. This has gone too far. Gone too far. As if my silence were an act of aggression rather than absence. I sat with that for the moment, then turned my phone face down. That night, Andrew did something he had never done before. He showed up unannounced at the place where I was staying. I knew it was him before I opened the door. His knock was sharp, impatient. The kind of knock meant to assert presence rather than request entry. When I opened it, he looked smaller than I remembered. Tired? His confidence, usually so carefully curated, had begun to fray at the edges. Can we talk? He asked already, stepping forward. I did not move aside immediately. I let the moment stretch. You can, I said. I'm listening. He paused, thrown off by the lack of invitation. Then he walked in, scanning the space quickly, as if searching for evidence of something he could categorize. Discomfort crossed his face when he found nothing familiar. I don't understand what you're doing, he said, cutting straight to the point. You can't just disappear like this. I didn't disappear, I replied. I left. He exhaled sharply. You know what I mean. I do, I said. That's why I chose the word carefully. He began pacing, his agitation filling the room. He spoke about pressure, about responsibility, about how everything had suddenly become more complicated. He talked about misunderstandings and miscommunications. He did not talk about the dinner, not once. When he finally stopped, he looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for reassurance, for alignment, for me to step back into place. Instead, I asked him a question. What exactly do you need from me? The room went quiet. He blinked clearly, unprepared. I need your help, he said slowly. Your insight. You know how things work. And why do I know how things work? I asked. He frowned. Because you've always been involved. No, I said. Because I paid attention when others didn't. Because I listened when it wasn't convenient. Because I took responsibility for outcomes that were never officially mine. He looked away. I continued, my voice steady. You didn't miss me when I was here. You missed the results. That's not fair, he said quickly. It's accurate, I replied. Silence stretched between us again, heavier this time. Finally, he said, So, what do you want? It was the wrong question. I don't want anything, I said. I'm not negotiating my return. He stared at me, disbelief flickering across his face. Then what is this? This, I said, gesturing around us, is what happens when I stop compensating. His expression hardened. You're punishing us. No, I said. I'm letting you experience reality without a buffer. He shook his head, frustration spilling over. You're being unreasonable. I met his gaze. You told me I wouldn't be missed. The words landed like a physical blow. His face flushed, then paled. For a moment, something like recognition flickered in his eyes. "That was a joke," he said weakly. "It was a truth," I replied. "At least it was meant to be." He stood there, caught between defensiveness and something closer to fear. "So what now?" "Now," I said, "you figure out how to operate without me. Or you figure out how to speak to me differently." He left shortly after that, his steps slower, his posture less assured. I closed the door and leaned against it, my hands trembling just slightly, not from doubt, but from release. The confrontation had not ended anything. It had clarified it. Andrew now understood that my silence was not a tantrum. It was a condition. And conditions once imposed demand a choice. He would make his soon enough. The first real fracture showed itself on Monday morning, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but changes the weight of everything that follows. I learned about it indirectly, the way I learned most truths during that period. Not from Andrew, not from Claire, but from the silence where there should have been confidence. By then, I had developed a habit. Every morning I woke early, made coffee, and checked nothing. No email, no messages, no news. I wanted my days to begin without their urgency dictating my mood. That morning, though, the quiet felt different. Taut, like a wire pulled too tight. It broke around 10. My phone buzzed once, then again. A number I did not recognize, but I answered anyway. "Is this Evelyn Harper?" a man asked. "Yes," I said. "This is Thomas Reed. We've never met. I'm calling from the board." "The board." I closed my eyes briefly, already understanding the significance. Andrew never let the board speak to me directly. He preferred to control the narrative. "What can I do for you, Mr. Reed?" I asked. There was a pause just long enough to reveal hesitation. "I'm trying to understand a discrepancy." I let him continue. "We were expecting the acquisition review to be finalized last Friday," he said. "Instead, we received 3 different summaries, all contradicting each other. No final recommendation, no risk assessment, no transition plan." I pictured the documents instantly. The review had been mine. Every detail, every projection, every red flag. I had spent weeks on it. "I see," I said calmly. "We're concerned," he continued. "This deal carries significant exposure. Historically, you were the one who ensured alignment." "Historically, that's correct," I said. "And you're no longer involved?" he asked. The question was careful, professional, but it landed with weight. "No," I said. "I'm not." Another pause, longer this time. "Then who is overseeing strategic continuity?" he asked. I smiled faintly, though he could not see it. "I assume the people who said they no longer needed me," I replied. Silence. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Harper," he said finally. "That answers my question." He hung up. I sat there for a moment, my coffee untouched. That call had not been an appeal. It had been a diagnostic test. And the results were not good. By noon, Andrew was calling again. This time I answered. "You spoke to the board," he said, immediately skipping any greeting. "They spoke to me," I replied. "That wasn't appropriate," he snapped. "I agree," I said evenly. "You should ask yourself why they felt it was necessary." He exhaled sharply. "They're nervous." "Then they should be," I said. "You're enjoying this," he accused. I considered the accusation carefully before responding. "No, I'm observing it." "You could fix this," he said, "in an afternoon." "Yes," I agreed. "I could." "Then why won't you?" he demanded. I waited. Let the silence stretch until it unsettled him. "Because fixing it would confirm that nothing has changed," I said. "And something has." He lowered his voice. "You're putting everything at risk." "No," I said. "You did that when you mistook my presence for permission." He did not respond immediately. When he did, his tone shifted. Less confrontational, more strategic. "What do you want?" he asked again. The question irritated me more this time. "I want to see what happens next," I said. "That's reckless," he said. "It's honest," I replied. for the first time in years. We ended the call without resolution. That afternoon, I received a message from Claire. Not an apology, not a demand, an invitation. Coffee, just us. We should talk. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won. We met at a small cafe neither of us frequented neutral ground. She arrived first, already seated, posture-rigid hands wrapped tightly around her cup. She looked older than she had a month ago. "You look well," she said as I sat down. "So do you," I replied, knowing it was not true. She smiled thinly. "This isn't easy for me." "I didn't think it would be," I said. She took a breath. "Andrew is under pressure. He always is," I replied. "This is different," she said. "Things are slipping." "Yes," I said. "That tends to happen when the load shifts suddenly." She bristled. "We didn't realize how much you were carrying." I tilted my head slightly. "No, you didn't." She looked down at her cup. "We assumed you were comfortable with the role." "I was capable," I corrected. "Comfortable is a different thing." She nodded slowly, absorbing that. "We need you back," she said finally. I met her gaze. "No. You need what I provided." She hesitated. "Is there a difference?" "Yes," I said. "One is a function, the other is a person." She was quiet for a long moment. "What if we change the structure?" she asked carefully. "Formalize things, give you authority." I almost laughed. "You offered me authority only after you felt the absence of it," I said. "That's not respect. That's reaction." Her jaw tightened. "You're being unfair." "No," I said gently. "I'm being accurate." She leaned back, frustration flickering across her face. "Then what would respect look like to you?" The question surprised me. It was the first genuine one she had asked. "It would look like listening before losing," I said. "It would look like not laughing at the table when someone is diminished." Her eyes widened slightly. "So he told you," she said. "He told everyone," I replied. That was the point. Color rose in her cheeks. "We didn't think you'd take it seriously." That, I said softly, is the problem. The conversation ended shortly after. Not hostile, not resolved, but altered. That evening, the consequences began to cascade. An email circulated among senior staff requesting clarification on overlapping responsibilities. Another followed, asking who held final approval on budget reallocations. By nightfall, a third asked whether certain commitments were still valid. No one answered. The system stalled. Andrew called me late, his voice strained. "They're hesitating," he said. "Everyone's waiting." For what, I asked. For direction. "And who used to provide it?" I asked. He was silent. "Say it," I said. "You," he admitted. "And why aren't they listening now?" I asked. "Because you're not here," he said. "Then perhaps," I replied, "they should listen to those who are." "You're forcing this," he said. "I'm revealing it," I corrected. That night, I slept better than I had in years. Not because I felt vindicated, but because the truth, once visible, no longer required my constant reinforcement. By the end of the week, the board postponed the acquisition. Publicly, it was framed as prudence. Privately, it was uncertainty. Andrew hated uncertainty more than loss. He came to see me again that Sunday. This time he did not knock. He waited. When I opened the door, he did not step forward. He stood there, hands at his sides, stripped of the urgency that had defined him before. "I underestimated you," he said. "Yes," I replied. "You did. I thought you would come back," he said. "Because you always have." I studied him, really looked at him. "And what if I don't?" I asked. He swallowed. "Then everything changes." I nodded. "That's the point." He looked at me then, not as a resource, not as a safety net, but as a variable he could not control. And in that moment, I knew something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer invisible. I was the absence they could not ignore. And the cost of that absence was just beginning to register. The moment Andrew realized the damage could not be quietly reversed was the moment he stopped trying to manage perception and started scrambling for control. It began with money. Not the dramatic kind, not yet. Just small delays. A payment approved a day late. A vendor suddenly asking for confirmation in writing. A bank requesting clarification on an authorization that had never required explanation before. I knew these signs well. In stable systems, money flows invisibly. When people start asking questions, it means trust is thinning. Andrew called me early that Tuesday. Too early. "Did you move anything?" he asked without greeting. "No," I said. "Why?" "The bank flagged a transaction," he said. "They want verification." And I asked. "And they specifically asked for you." I let the silence do its work. "That's not possible," he continued quickly. "You're not authorized anymore." "No," I agreed. "I'm not." "Then why would they?" "Because I was the one who built the safeguards," I said. "Some of them were never visible to you." His breath caught. "What safeguards?" I smiled faintly. "The ones that kept you from ever needing to know they existed." That afternoon, a second call came in. This time from legal. A junior partner, careful and polite, asked whether I had formally relinquished advisory status. When I said I had not, there was an audible shift in his tone. "That creates an exposure," he said. "For whom?" I asked. "For everyone," he replied. I thanked him and ended the call. By evening, Andrew was frantic. He arrived unannounced again, this time without arrogance. His shoulders were tight, his movements abrupt. He did not sit. He paced. "This isn't about pride anymore," he said. "This is about survival." "You should have thought of that earlier," I replied. "We can fix this," he insisted. "We just need to stabilize things, temporarily. I'll make it worth your while." There it was. The transactional instinct, the assumption that everything, including loyalty, had a price. "You already paid me," I said. He stopped pacing. "What?" With silence, I continued. With dismissal, with laughter. He clenched his jaw. "That was never my intention." "Intentions don't undo outcomes," I said. He leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice. "Tell me what you want." I studied him carefully. "I want you to experience the consequences without me cushioning them." He shook his head. "You're enjoying this?" "No," I said. "I'm learning from it." That night, Claire made her move. She sent an email to the board copying Andrew and several senior staff. It was framed as an update, but it was a maneuver. She proposed a restructuring, new reporting lines, temporary oversight committees. She positioned herself at the center. I read it slowly, recognizing the strategy immediately. She was trying to replace me structurally without acknowledging my role functionally. It wouldn't work. The board responded within hours. They asked questions. They asked for historical context. They asked who had previously coordinated risk mitigation. My name surfaced repeatedly, not because I demanded it, because the record said so. Andrew called me after midnight. They're questioning everything he said hoarsely. They're asking how much you handled, and how much did you tell them I asked. "I didn't have to," he said. "They can see it." I nodded to myself. The truth has a way of surfacing when people stop editing it. The next morning, something shifted inside the organization. It was subtle but decisive. People stopped improvising. They stopped guessing. They waited. Meetings ended without conclusions. Decisions were deferred. Emails piled up unanswered. Without a central nervous system, the body froze. Andrew tried to assert authority. He issued directives. He demanded progress reports. He threatened consequences. It only made things worse. Fear does not create clarity. It creates paralysis. By Friday, the board scheduled an emergency session. Andrew asked me to attend. As an observer, he said. I almost declined. Almost. But curiosity won again. The meeting was tense. Faces tight. Voices careful. They spoke about exposure, about leadership gaps, about continuity. Then someone asked the question no one had wanted to ask. What happens if Evelyn doesn't come back? The room went still. Andrew looked down. No one answered immediately. Finally, Thomas Reed spoke. "Then we adapt," he said. "But we should be honest about the cost." "What cost?" someone asked. He looked directly at the camera. "We lose institutional memory. We lose trust buffers. We lose the person who prevented small failures from becoming large ones." I said nothing. Andrew cleared his throat. "Evelyn is considering her options." I unmuted myself. "I'm not considering," I said calmly. "I've decided." Every face turned toward me. "I will not return to the role I had." I continued. "That role existed because others benefited from my invisibility." Andrew looked like he'd been struck. "If I am to be involved at all," I said, "it will be under conditions that reflect accountability and respect." Silence followed. Then questions, practical ones, structural ones. I answered selectively, not as a savior, as a boundary. After the call ended, Andrew stayed behind. "You humiliated me," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "You were revealed." He ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't," I said. "You live with it." He looked at me, something close to fear in his eyes. "You could destroy us." "I could," I agreed. "But I won't. Why not?" he asked. "Because destruction is easy," I said. "Reckoning is harder." That weekend, the calls stopped. Not because the crisis had passed, because something deeper had shifted. They were no longer asking me to rescue them. They were trying to understand what they had taken for granted. And in that space, for the first time, I felt something unexpected. Not power, freedom. I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. And Andrew, for the first time in his life, was forced to do the same. The collapse did not come with noise or spectacle. It arrived quietly, disguised as procedure. On Monday morning, Andrew sent out a memo. It was written in the careful language of containment. Temporary reassignment, interim leadership, streamlining decision paths. He framed it as efficiency, as modernization, as a necessary evolution. I read it once, then again. He was trying to write me out without saying my name. He reassigned responsibilities I had once carried to 3 different people, none of whom spoke to each other. He split authority into fragments, assuming that if no one held the whole picture, no one would notice the absence of the center. It was a common mistake. One I had seen many times. Systems do not fail because of missing parts. They fail because of missing coherence. By noon, my phone began to buzz again. Not Andrew, not Claire, others. People who had never contacted me directly before. Senior managers, external partners, even a long-time client who opened the call with an awkward laugh and said, "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but you're the only person who ever gave me straight answers." I listened more than I spoke. Patterns emerged quickly. Deadlines were being reinterpreted. Commitments were being renegotiated without consensus. Decisions were being made, then quietly reversed when someone higher up disagreed. Chaos was seeping in through the cracks Andrew had created himself. That afternoon, I received a calendar invite. Board review. Mandatory attendance requested, not optional. That alone told me everything. The meeting began with formalities, but the tension was obvious. The agenda was crowded. Too crowded, a sign of unresolved issues stacked on top of each other. Andrew presented first. He spoke confidently, but there was a strain beneath the surface. He used words like alignment and transition, but avoided specifics. He spoke of resilience without naming what had broken. Then the questions began. They were polite. They were relentless. One board member asked about delayed vendor payments. Another asked about contradictory internal guidance. A third asked why 3 departments were operating under different assumptions about the same project. Andrew answered as best he could, but each response revealed another gap. Finally, Thomas Reed leaned forward. "Before we continue," he said, "I want to ask a foundational question." The room stilled. "Who currently holds integrative oversight? he asked. Not on paper. In practice. Andrew opened his mouth, then closed it. Claire glanced at him, then looked away. Silence stretched. I felt every eye drift toward me. I believe Thomas continued that role used to be informally occupied by Evelyn. He did not say it accusatorily. He said it clinically, as one might note the absence of a load-bearing wall after the roof begins to sag. Andrew stiffened. We've redistributed those responsibilities. Thomas nodded. I see that on the chart. What I'm asking is whether redistribution has translated to execution. No one answered. I unmuted myself. It hasn't, I said calmly. Andrew shot me a look, but I kept my gaze on the board. Because oversight is not a task, I continued. It's a relationship between parts. You can't divide it without consequences. Thomas nodded slowly. So what happens next? Another board member asked. Andrew turned toward me, desperation barely concealed. That depends on Evelyn. I inhaled steady. No, I said. It depends on whether you want truth or comfort. The room was silent. If you want comfort, I continued, you can pretend this is a temporary disruption and hope it resolves itself. It won't. If you want truth, I said you acknowledge that this system was stabilized by invisible labor you dismissed, and you decide whether you're willing to confront that. The call ended shortly after. Not with resolution, with awareness. That night, Claire called me. Her voice was tight, controlled. You blindsided us. I answered a question, I replied. You undermined Andrew. He undermined himself, I said. I simply stopped compensating. She exhaled sharply. Do you have any idea what this is doing to him? Yes, I said. I lived it. She was quiet, then softer. This is bigger than pride now. It always was, I replied. The next day, the board made its move. They commissioned an independent operational audit, not financial, structural, the kind that exposes informal power flows, dependency chains, and decision bottlenecks, the kind that names names. Andrew was furious. He called me once then, twice. I didn't answer. By the end of the week, the report was underway. Interviews scheduled, records requested, histories examined. The organization was being forced to look at itself honestly. And honesty is rarely flattering. On Saturday morning, Andrew came to see me again. He did not knock this time. He rang the bell. When I opened the door, he stood back, hands visible, posture careful, like a man approaching something unpredictable. I didn't think it would go this far, he said. It always does, I replied. They're dissecting everything he said. They're asking about decisions from years ago. Yes, I said, because patterns don't begin yesterday. He rubbed his face. They're asking why certain risks were never escalated. Because I handled them, I said. They're asking why certain relationships held even when others fractured. I invested in them, I said. They're asking why failures never reached the surface. I met his gaze, because I absorbed them. He looked at me, then truly looked as if seeing the outline of something he had never fully acknowledged. You made me look good, he said quietly. No, I said. I made the system functional. He swallowed. And now? Now I said the system has to learn to function without exploitation. He shook his head. They might recommend changes that cost me my position. Possibly, I said. And you're fine with that, he asked. I'm not invested in protecting outcomes built on denial, I replied. He was silent for a long moment. Then he asked the question I had been waiting for. What would it take for you to come back? I considered it carefully. Not a title, I said, not money. Then, what he asked. Accountability, I said. Public acknowledgement of what was done and who did it. Structural protection against invisibility. And a guarantee that respect is not conditional on usefulness. He let out a bitter laugh. That would change everything. Yes, I said. That's why it matters. He nodded slowly. I don't know if they'll agree. Then you'll know where you stand, I replied. After he left, I sat alone for a long time. I did not feel triumphant. I felt clear. The audit would run its course. The truth would surface whether I intervened or not. My power no longer came from being indispensable. It came from being undeniable. And somewhere deep within the system, the lesson was taking root. You can erase a person, but you cannot erase what they held together, not without consequences. The audit cracked the foundation in places Andrew had never thought to reinforce. It began with interviews, not dramatic interrogations, just quiet conversations conducted by calm people with notebooks and neutral expressions. They asked simple questions. Who approved this? Who resolved that? Who intervened when timelines slipped? Who decided not to escalate? The same name kept appearing. Mine. I learned this not because anyone told me, but because the questions changed. People stopped asking what had happened recently and started asking what used to happen before. Patterns were being traced backward. Andrew tried to contain it. He issued another memo, emphasizing cooperation and transparency. He encouraged everyone to be forthcoming, confident that openness would diffuse suspicion. Instead, it focused it. By midweek, the auditors requested access to historical communications, email threads, meeting notes, decision logs, informal correspondence. The invisible became visible. I received a call from one of the auditors, a woman named Elaine Porter. Her voice was measured professional. "We've noticed something unusual," she said. "I imagine you have," I replied. "There are gaps," she continued. "Entire decisions that appear fully resolved without any documented escalation." "Yes," I said. "Those were mine." She paused. "That's precisely the issue." "Which one?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "The system relied on you to absorb risk without record. That's not sustainable." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." The audit report was not yet finalized, but its direction was already clear. Andrew sensed it before he saw it. He stopped calling, not out of pride, but out of fear. When he finally did reach out again, it was not to ask for help. It was to ask for loyalty. "We need to present a united front," he said, his voice low. "This could spiral." "Spirals happen when people cling," I replied. "Not when they let go." "You don't understand what's at stake," he said. "I understand exactly," I said. "That's why I won't intervene." 2 days later, the preliminary findings leaked. Not to the press, to the staff. Someone forwarded a summary. No names yet, but conclusions were unmistakable. Over-reliance on informal authority, suppression of escalation, concentration of operational knowledge in a single unofficial role. A role I had never asked for. The mood shifted immediately. People grew cautious. Conversations became guarded. Suddenly, everyone remembered moments when they had deferred to me, when they had let me handle things rather than take responsibility themselves. Guilt surfaced. So did resentment. I received messages that ranged from gratitude to accusation. "You protected us. You made us lazy. You should have spoken up. You were the only one who knew. All of it was true." Andrew convened a leadership meeting that Friday. This time, he did not invite me. It did not matter. The decisions made there rippled outward anyway. They created a temporary oversight council. They reassigned authority formally. They proposed a new reporting structure designed to prevent single-point dependency. It sounded reasonable. It also sounded hollow, because structure does not replace trust. That evening, Claire came to see me alone. She did not bring arguments this time. She brought wine. We sat across from each other in silence for a while before she spoke. "They are positioning him," she said. "For what I asked." "For a sacrifice," she replied. I nodded. "That's predictable. They think if they isolate the failure to leadership blindness, they can contain the damage." "And can they?" I asked. She looked at her glass. "Not completely." She met my eyes. "They're asking why I didn't intervene." I tilted my head. "And why didn't you?" She swallowed. "Because I didn't think it was my place." I smiled faintly. "Now you know how I felt." She sighed. This is bigger than Andrew. Yes, I said. It always was. She hesitated, then asked quietly, Do you want him gone? I considered the question carefully. No, I said. I want him awake. Claire nodded slowly. That might be worse. Growth often is, I replied. The audit's second phase landed like a controlled detonation. This time names were attached, not just mine. Andrew's, Claire's, others. Responsibilities misaligned, decisions centralized without accountability. Cultures of silence rewarded. The board responded swiftly. Andrew was asked to step back temporarily. Claire was reassigned. A transition committee was formed. The organization held its breath. Andrew did not call me. He came. He looked different when I opened the door. Thinner, quieter. No performance left. They're pushing me out, he said simply. Are they? I asked. He nodded. They want me to resign, gracefully. I gestured for him to sit. He didn't. They asked me who I learned leadership from, he continued. Who shaped my decision-making? I waited. I told them the truth, he said. I told them it was you. I studied his face, searching for irony. There was none. They asked why I dismissed you, he said. I didn't have a good answer. No, I agreed. You didn't. He exhaled slowly. I thought authority meant independence. It doesn't, I said. It means responsibility. He nodded, absorbing that. They want you, he said finally. Not to return. To testify. To what I asked. To what you did, he said. And what it cost you. I considered it. That would expose a lot, I said. Yes, he replied. Including me. I met his gaze. Are you ready for that? He hesitated, then said, I don't think I have a choice. The hearing was not public, but it was thorough. I spoke calmly. I stated facts. I did not accuse. I did not defend. I explained how systems drift when unacknowledged labor becomes expected, how silence can masquerade as stability, how people confuse absence of crisis with absence of risk. I spoke about the dinner only once, briefly, as an example of culture, not cruelty. The room was quiet when I finished. The board thanked me. Andrew did not look at me. When it ended, he approached me in the hallway. I never meant to erase you, he said quietly. I know, I replied. You just didn't notice when you did. He nodded, eyes wet. I'm sorry. It was the first time he had said it without conditions. I accepted it, not because it fixed anything, but because it was real. A week later, Andrew resigned. The announcement was measured, respectful, focused on transition. The organization moved on, as it always does. I was offered a formal advisory role. I declined. Instead, I proposed something else, a framework, a mentorship program, a system designed to prevent invisibility. They accepted, not because they owed me, because they understood. I walked away lighter than I had in years. Not vindicated, unburdened. The system would continue, but it would no longer feed on silence, and neither would I. The vacuum Andrew left behind did not stay empty for long. Power never tolerates absence. It reorganizes itself quietly, looking for the next shape willing to contain it. In the weeks after his resignation, the building felt unfamiliar. Not chaotic, but exposed. Meetings were smaller. Voices were softer. People asked more questions than they answered. Decisions took longer, not because no one was capable, but because no one wanted to be wrong in the same way again. I watched all of this from a distance. For the first time in years, the system was not leaning on me without consent. It was learning to stand upright awkwardly, like a body relearning balance after a long illness. That should have been the end of my story. It wasn't. The call came late one evening from a number I hadn't seen in months. My son. I let it ring twice before answering. Mom, he said. His voice sounded older than I remembered, less sharp, less certain. Yes, I replied. I heard about Andrew, he said. About everything. I assumed you would, I said. There was a pause. I didn't know, he added quickly. How central you were. That's usually how invisibility works, I replied. He exhaled slowly. I've been thinking about what I said. That night, I waited. I was wrong, he said, and I know saying that doesn't undo it. No, I agreed. It doesn't. Another pause, longer this time. I don't expect you to come back, he said. I want to understand what you're doing now. The question surprised me. Not because it was curious, but because it wasn't demanding. I'm building something new, I said, quietly. What kind of thing, he asked. A structure that doesn't collapse when one person leaves, I replied. A place where contribution is visible, not assumed. He was silent for a moment. Then softly, can I see it? I closed my eyes, briefly. Yes, I said, but not as a favor. I wouldn't expect one, he replied. When he visited a week later, he didn't bring assumptions with him. He brought questions. He listened more than he spoke. He watched how people interacted, how decisions were made in the open, not inside conversations, how disagreements were documented, not buried. At one point, he turned to me and said quietly, "This feels different." "It is," I said, "because it's honest." He nodded, absorbing that. What he didn't know yet was that honesty had a cost. The framework I had proposed, the one the board accepted, was beginning to ripple outward. Other departments wanted versions of it. Other organizations asked questions. Invitations arrived not for me, but for the idea. That attention made some people nervous, including Claire. She called one afternoon, her tone cautious. "You're becoming influential again," she said. "I never stopped being influential," I replied. "I just stopped being silent." She hesitated. "There are people who think you're positioning yourself." "For what?" I asked. "For control," she said. I laughed softly. "Control requires leverage. I have boundaries." She didn't sound convinced. The truth was, the system was uncomfortable with someone who refused both subservience and dominance. I didn't fit the old categories. I wasn't angling for Andrew's old seat. I wasn't disappearing either. I was something else. And systems hate ambiguity. The pushback began subtly. A proposal delayed. A meeting rescheduled without explanation. A resource quietly reallocated. Nothing overt, nothing confrontational, but familiar. I recognized the pattern immediately. They were testing whether I would step in, whether I would compensate again. I didn't. Instead, I documented everything. Dates, decisions, omissions, not as evidence, as clarity. When the friction became visible enough to address, I addressed it openly. In writing, with names attached, with context. No drama, no accusation, just truth. That unsettled them more than anger ever could. My son noticed. "You're not fighting," he said one evening. "You're standing." "Yes," I replied. "How did you learn that?" he asked. I looked at him. By fighting for decades and realizing it never taught anyone anything. He nodded slowly. "I don't want to repeat that." "Then don't," I said. "But understand that not repeating it means disappointing people who benefit from your exhaustion." He smiled faintly. "I think I'm starting to understand you." That was new. The real test came when the board proposed expanding my framework across the organization, formalizing it, attaching my name. I declined. Instead, I suggested a collective authorship, shared ownership, rotating leadership. The room went quiet. "That dilutes accountability," someone said. "No," I replied. "It distributes it." They didn't like that answer, but they accepted it, reluctantly, because the alternative was returning to a system they had just watched collapse. After the meeting, my son walked beside me in silence. "You could have taken credit," he said finally. "I could have, I agreed. "Why didn't you?" "Because credit is a currency that attracts debt," I said. "I've paid enough." He considered that. I used to think power meant being untouchable, he said. And now I asked. I think it means being clear, he replied. Clear enough that people can't pretend not to see you. I smiled. You're learning, I said. Not long after the final audit addendum was released. Quietly, without headlines. It acknowledged the reforms, the cultural shifts, the structural changes. It also included a line that mattered more than any title. Future risk mitigation must not rely on unacknowledged individual labor. That sentence was the legacy. Not mine. Everyone's. The last call from Andrew came a month later. Not to ask for anything. Just to tell me he'd started over somewhere smaller, somewhere quieter. I'm trying to do it differently, he said. I hope so, I replied. I wanted you to know, he added. I hear your voice now. In meetings, in pauses. It's annoying, I laughed. Good. After we hung up, I sat alone for a long time. I thought about the woman I had been when my son laughed at that table. The woman who believed endurance was love. Silence was grace. She had disappeared, and in her place stood someone who did not need to be missed to matter. The system no longer depended on me, and that was the point. Because what I built wasn't a throne. It was a foundation, and foundations don't demand attention. They just hold. The silence that followed felt different from all the others. It wasn't the brittle quiet of avoidance or the tense stillness before a confrontation. It was spacious, unclaimed. The kind of silence that waits to see what you'll build inside it. For the first time in decades, no one was calling me to fix something they had broken. No one was hovering at the edge of a decision hoping I would step in and absorb the risk. The systems I had helped reshape were functioning without leaning on my spine. That freedom came with an unexpected weight. When you stop being needed, you are forced to ask who you are without the emergency. I discovered this one ordinary morning while standing in my kitchen, staring at a calendar that was almost completely blank. No meetings, no deadlines, no quiet crises disguised as quick questions, just time. I poured coffee and sat at the table, hands wrapped around the mug, and felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected. Grief. Not for Andrew, not for the organization. For the version of myself that had believed usefulness was the same thing as love. That belief had been passed down to me so quietly, I never noticed when it became law. Be reliable, be steady, don't make noise. If you hold everything together, people will keep you close. But closeness built on utility is a fragile thing. The moment you stop functioning, you become invisible. My son called later that day, not with a problem, with a story. He told me about a meeting he'd been in one where a decision stalled because no one wanted to take responsibility. He said he'd waited heart racing and then spoke up. Named the risk, named the uncertainty, didn't smooth it over. They didn't like it, he said, but they listened. I smiled to myself. How did that feel? Terrifying, he admitted. And clean. Clean, that was the word. He paused, then added, I think I finally understand what you meant about not cushioning everything. Yes, I said softly. It teaches people the wrong lesson. After we hung up, I went for a walk. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, but I noticed different things now. The sound of my own footsteps, the way my shoulders no longer sat permanently tense, the absence of urgency humming under my skin. I passed a woman struggling with grocery bags and helped her carry them to her door. She thanked me genuinely, and for a brief moment, the old reflex flared. The impulse to do more, to offer help before it was asked, to prove my value through effort. I stopped myself. Kindness is not the same as self-erasure. That distinction mattered more than I had ever been taught. Later that week, I received an invitation I hadn't expected. Not from the board, not from any institution, from a group of women. They had been watching quietly, they said, watching what happened when I stepped away, watching the system wobble then recalibrate, watching someone refuse both martyrdom and domination. They wanted to talk, not about strategy, about boundaries. We met in a small room with mismatched chairs and no agenda. Women from different industries, different ages, all carrying the same familiar tension in their posture. They told stories that sounded too much like my own, of being the one who remembered, the one who smoothed, the one who absorbed the fallout so others could stay clean, of being praised for resilience while slowly disappearing. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't give advice. I told the truth. I told them that disappearing was not an act of revenge. It was an act of correction. I told them that systems will always take what you offer without asking how much it costs you. And I told them the hardest part wasn't leaving. It was staying gone long enough for reality to recalibrate. One woman asked, voice shaking, "But what if they don't change?" I met her eyes. Then you learned something important. What? That the system didn't love you. It consumed you. The room was quiet after that. Not heavy, focused. When I got home, I found an email waiting for me, from my son. Just a sentence, "Thank you for not rescuing me." I stared at it for a long time. That sentence carried more weight than any apology, because it meant he had felt the ground under his own feet, had stumbled, had stood back up without a hand lifting him prematurely. That night, I dreamed of the dinner table. But it was different this time. The laughter was gone. The tension was gone. The words that had cut me loose no longer echoed. Instead, the chair where I used to sit was empty, and no one was pretending not to notice. I woke with my heart steady. In the days that followed, small confirmations appeared. The framework continued to spread, adapted by people who understood its purpose. Not to replace one authority with another, but to distribute responsibility so no one disappeared again. Andrew sent a brief message. No self-pity, no justification. Just this: I'm learning to sit with discomfort instead of outsourcing it. I replied with a single word: good. The old version of me would have followed that with reassurance. This one didn't. As weeks passed, my calendar filled again, but differently. With conversations, not crises. With invitations that did not assume compliance. With work that ended when the day ended. One afternoon, my son came by unannounced. He stood in the doorway, hesitant. "I almost didn't come," he admitted. Why, I asked. I didn't want to take up space. I smiled gently. Taking up space is not the same as taking advantage. He nodded, relieved. We sat together quietly, no agenda between us. And for the first time since that dinner, I felt something settle into place. Not reconciliation, alignment. Before he left, he said something that stayed with me. "I used to think disappearing meant losing," he said. "Now I think it means refusing the wrong terms." "Yes," I replied. "Exactly." When the door closed behind him, I stood for a moment in the quiet. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who believed endurance was virtue, that love meant never letting anything fall. She had disappeared, and in doing so, she had made room for someone else. Someone who could be present without being consumed. Someone who no longer needed to be missed to be whole. The reckoning was complete. What remained was choice. And I was finally free to make it. The morning I realized no one was waiting for me to disappear anymore. I understood how complete the transformation truly was. It happened quietly. No announcement, no validation, just the absence of expectation. I woke up to sunlight filtering through the window, the kind that doesn't demand anything of you. My phone sat on the nightstand, untouched, silent. Not because something was wrong, but because nothing was missing. That used to terrify me. For most of my life, silence meant neglect. It meant I had failed to anticipate a need, missed a cue, overlooked a responsibility. Silence was something to be fixed. Now it felt earned. I made breakfast slowly. I cleaned up after myself without rushing. I noticed how my hands moved differently when they weren't braced for interruption. There was no tension in my shoulders, no low hum of urgency vibrating under my skin. This was what presence felt like when it wasn't transactional. Later that day, I met my son for lunch, not because he needed advice, not because something was broken, because he wanted to see me. He arrived early, already seated, already waiting. When he stood to greet me, I noticed how he held himself now. Straighter, not defensive, not apologetic, just present. We talked about ordinary things, work, weather, a book he was reading. There were pauses in the conversation, and neither of us rushed to fill them. Silence sat between us comfortably, no longer loaded with resentment or expectation. At one point he looked at me and said, "I don't think I ever thanked you properly." I didn't respond immediately. For what I asked finally. For leaving, he said. For not staying when it would have been easier for everyone if you did. I studied his face. He wasn't asking for absolution. He wasn't trying to repair anything. He was acknowledging a truth. If I hadn't felt the gap, he continued, I would have spent my whole life assuming someone else would always catch me. I nodded. That's why I stayed gone. He smiled, small and genuine. I know. When we parted, there was no heaviness, no unfinished business, just mutual respect. In the weeks that followed, I watched the world keep moving without orbiting me, and instead of shrinking, my life expanded. I chose what I participated in. I declined without explanation. I accepted without guilt. I worked on projects that ended cleanly and left space behind them. The systems I had helped reshape continued to function. People adapted. Mistakes happened. Accountability followed. No one vanished. That mattered. One evening, I found myself thinking about the woman I used to be at that table. The one who sat quietly while laughter rolled over her, who absorbed the words, meant to reduce her, and called it love. She thought disappearing would destroy her. She thought absence meant erasure. She was wrong. Disappearing was the only way I could finally be seen. Not by others first, by myself. I no longer confuse endurance with virtue. I no longer mistake silence for grace. I no longer believe that being needed is the same as being valued. Those illusions died when I walked away. And in their place grew something steadier. Self-trust. The truth is, my son was right about one thing that night, even if he didn't understand what he was saying. If the woman I was had disappeared, no one would have missed her, because she was exhausted, because she was invisible, because she existed only in what she provided. So I let her disappear. And the woman who remained is not waiting to be missed. She is here. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been the one holding everything together while pretending it didn't cost you anything? Have you ever been told directly or indirectly that your presence only mattered as long as you were useful? If so, you're not alone. And you're not wrong for wanting more. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what part hit closest to home. Your voice matters here. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, hard boundaries, and what happens when the tables finally turn, stay with me. Subscribe and we'll keep telling them together. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight louder. It's to disappear long enough to let the truth speak for itself.